All right, folks, how are you today? We are starting a series on yoga seated postures. This was going to be our theme in the studio for the month of April, and we wanted to continue to offer this theme to you, even though there's nobody here except for me and my lovely assistant, Kaylee. So, I'm sure we've all been there when you come into a yoga class and you get down onto the floor and you're sitting there, and as the class is getting ready to start, the yoga instructor says, let's all come into our most comfortable seated pose. And at that point, the inner dialogue that you're hearing in your mind is comfortable seated pose. That doesn't exist. Those aren't real things because we're on the floor and maybe you've crossed the legs, maybe not, but this might be a starting point that is anything but comfortable to you. You might feel that this is a lot of discomfort in your back. It might be a lot of discomfort in your hips. It might be just a lot of discomfort on your sits bones or wherever else. So that could be a place where right off the bat in your yoga practice, you are already feeling disconnected and uncomfortable. So what we wanted to do was offer some options for you about how to make sitting in yoga more comfortable and how to notice the differences between what our seated yoga poses are, because there are actually quite a few that could look very similar. So I'll just start because all of the poses I'm going to talk about in this section today are going to be, we're going to call them by their Sanskrit names. And so you will hear asana at the end of each and every one of these words. So the word asana in Sanskrit literally translates to yoga pose or yoga seat. So that's why you are going to hear it. And you've probably, if you've been taking yoga for a while, you've probably been hearing asana in a lot of your practices, whether it's Tadasana, Sukhasana, Adho Mukha Svanasana, Shavasana. So you're going to hear asana often because that is the physical pose that we're coming to. So we're going to start by demonstrating what this pose right here is, because it's actually not a yoga pose. You could call this crisscross applesauce. Maybe that's something that you learned in kindergarten. Maybe you learned it by another name. But this by itself is not technically a yoga pose, although it is a comfortable seated space for a lot of folks. Now, if crisscross applesauce does not feel like the most comfortable place for you, you have a few options. So maybe one quick and easy thing to make it more comfortable, I'm going to have my wonderful assistant here. If you just want to slide that blanket underneath your seat and prop on up, that can be a very easy way to make a seated yoga pose go from uncomfortable and stressful and frustrating to bearable, doable, maybe not exactly what you want it to be, but it can take away a lot of the beginning frustrations with it. So what happened when Kaylee put the blanket under her seat was the seat provides a little bit of elevation, which gives a small shift in the way your pelvis is tilted, which then allows your hip flexors to relax, which can also alleviate some of the tension that you were feeling in your back. So if a seated yoga pose feels difficult to you from the get-go, maybe try a blanket. Now, if a blanket didn't offer enough relief, I'll demonstrate this, but you can see how the blanket is nice and soft, and that's going to push underneath the weight of your body. If a blanket didn't offer enough relief for you, you can take a block or a bolster, and what you'll notice with this is now the angle of my pelvis is spilling much more forward. I've actually got a little bit of a tilt, so that allowed my legs to relax a whole lot more while I'm here. So again, these are going to be things that are going to alleviate some of the tightness you might experience in your hip flexors. It's going to alleviate some of the stress and tension you feel in your back. And for those of us who, when we're feeling tightness in other parts of our body, start to express tightness in our shoulders or our necks or even hunch the back, this might be a place where once again you're feeling like there's space between your ears and your shoulders and where there's length going up your spine. So adding blanket or block could just be that magical little shift in your yoga practice. So I'm going to remove this block, and Kaylee, you can stay on the blanket or you can get rid of it if you want to. I'm comfortable. So our first seated pose is called Sukhasana, which is translated to easy seated pose. So here, rather than have my legs crisscrossed over and under one another, I've started by placing one foot to the floor and then my other foot's going to come in front of it. And so they are both laying on the mat rather than one tucking up underneath the other. And the simple ways of moving into Sukhasana and supporting your Sukhasana are going to be very similar to what we just did in crisscross applesauce. Maybe you add a bolster, a blanket, or a block, and that just creates a little bit of elevation. So the benefits of Sukhasana, easy seated pose, you'll probably see this most often at the beginning of your practice because this allows for space and time for us to notice the breathing. Hopefully while you're here, once you've added props, if props make sense for you, you're feeling a nice long side body where you can expand and contract the rib cage as you are inhaling and exhaling through the lungs. So this is a good spot where we allow time for centering and observing the breath. We work in our pranayama technique. Now, most often we all have a dominant way of sitting. So you'll notice my right leg is forward, Kaylee's left leg is forward. If you're spending a lot of time in your easy seated pose, Sukhasana, you might want to at some point recross those legs. And now this might not be the same exact easy seated pose as it was on the other side. My left hip flexor is tighter than my right hip flexor. So my left knee doesn't fall as comfortably and easy as my right knee did. So if one of the things that you're noticing is a limiting factor or a place of discomfort that is distracting to you in your yoga practice, if it's this lifted leg that doesn't want to settle down, you could tuck a block in there. And so now my leg has something to rest on, so I don't feel as though I have to hold tension in my hip flexor. I can allow that leg to roll out however far it is able and willing to roll out. Give it something to be supported by so that while I'm here in my easy seated pose and I'm working on my breath and I'm working on my intention, I'm not being constantly drawn out of that by the fact that my hip flexor is starting to burn because it's holding up the weight of my leg the whole time. So I've just given it a little bit of a prop. So you will notice from one side to the other that your body is not exactly the same. One side just might be happy-go-lucky and willing to do everything you ask it to, and the other side might be very obstinate and ornery and not willing to do the things. But this is our easy seated pose, and this is the pose that more often than not you will see at the beginning of your practice for seated centering. All right. So now we're going to move into Padmasana, which is a seated lotus pose. Not that this is the most easy transition, not that this is the most easy pose. However, it is a fairly simple transition from Sukhasana. So if in Sukhasana we've got both feet on the floor, in Padmasana we're going to start by taking one foot on top of the thigh. So again, this is different than your crisscross applesauce in the fact that you've pulled a foot up to rest on top of the thigh so that you can look down at the sole of your foot, and maybe it looks like a lotus flower petal. Or maybe you notice that you need a pedicure or something else. So here again in Padmasana, we want to adjust those sits bones, maybe adding a blanket, maybe adding a block. Those might be things that help to make Padmasana go from excruciating to tolerable. And I want you to be very aware of where that fine line exists. So when you first start practicing poses like Padmasana, one thing you might notice in this seated lotus is that my ankle now starts to speak to me a whole lot more, because my ankle is now kind of inverted a little bit. It's pulled up, and so the angle of my ankle has changed, and I'm trying not to move my hands in the way a whole lot, but you can see this ankle has a small upward curve, whereas this ankle stays fairly flat in its position. So your ankles might now be a factor that you have to consider moving into Padmasana. There is that fine line of noticing, is this pose uncomfortable and potentially harmful? Am I leading myself to a space of injury? Or is this pose uncomfortable and it's going to take time for my body to get used to it, familiar with it, and can I grow from this pose? And I usually tell folks a good rule of thumb: if when you get into your yoga pose, you want to stop breathing because it hurts and you're struggling and you feel yourself getting tense in other parts of the body, that might be a good indicator that this is harming you, that this is pushing you into a place of potential injury. If you get into a pose and you are very aware of new spaces, like my ankle right now, but it's not hurting, it's not causing me to get fearful and tense, then it might just be a space where I have some room to grow, where that's eventually going to feel better. Now this is a half Padmasana, Ardha Padmasana, or a half seated lotus. If we were to move into the full, we're going to do that on the other side so that we can real quick switch legs. So for the other half, we would do the same thing. We would pull one leg up on top and the new legs down on bottom. And again, noticing this side feels much more comfortable and willing to accept this seated lotus pose than the opposite side did for me. I'm going to show real quick one other thing. If you notice the angle of Kaylee's ankle bone compared to my ankle bone, her legs are falling out a whole lot flatter than mine, so she's probably got more loose hip flexors. So her foot's not having to tuck up as high onto a thigh as mine is. So that's going to play into it again. Now, if I were to change my seat and offer the assistance of the block, I can settle into this Padmasana a whole lot more because my hips are now shifted, or if I were to have used a blanket, and that also could alleviate some of the stress that I feel on my ankle while we're here. Now this again was the half. Let's go ahead and move into the full. I will tell you I don't have it on this side, so maybe Kaylee does. For the full, you're going to pull both legs up. Well, there we go, it worked today. So both legs could come up on top. I see both of my lotus flower petals while I'm here. I notice a lot more movement in my ankle bones, but I also feel that the weight of my low legs is pressing down on my legs. So I'm feeling some new length coming down through my hip flexors from my low abdomen through the hinges of my hips. So that's one full lotus. We'll try the opposite. Maybe this is the side I don't have. And then we can come around again and pull things up. So the full lotus is nice if you've got it. It's not necessary if you don't have it. There's the option of adding a block, a bolster, or a blanket. That actually makes my hip flexors feel a little bit more intense because now my knees are pulling forward. So you want to play around with this. Just looking at somebody else's variation of a pose doesn't mean that that's what your variation of the pose pose is going to look like. They might all look very different. So I'm going to come on out and let that flop. So here we can, for just a moment, let's release those legs. Swish the feet from side to side, release the tension that may have been building up in your ankles. If you've taken yin classes with us, you know that when you move from one pose to another, there's a little bit of fuzziness, a little bit of friction, or that kind of sleepiness that as we're reawakening the joints. So that was Sukhasana and Padmasana. Now we're going to go into Gomukhasana, which is cow face pose. And when we move into Gomukhasana, we'll first talk about the legs in cow face, and then we'll talk about what the arms could do in cow face. Cow face is a bigger hip opening pose. And so far, the poses that we've done have really been focused on the inside hip hinges. And with Gomukhasana, we're going to start to feel a lot of movement coming from the outside edges of the hips and from the sacrum. So to start with, we'll bring one leg down and angle that knee forward. And then we're going to cross the opposite leg over and adjust the seat. So Gomukhasana can also be called knee pile, because we've just piled one knee on top of the other. If you've taken our yin classes, you might see a similar pose called shoelace. So here, what we begin to feel almost immediately is the stretch that's coming on the outer band of our hips, around the bum and down into the outer edges of the thigh. Now I do have bony ankles, so for me in Gomukhasana, I'm going to fold my blanket, my mat up a little bit so that it gives some more padding. You can do Gomukhasana with a blanket under your seat, and do you want to do that real quick? And again, the benefit of adding the blanket under the seat is if when you moved into Gomukhasana, your top leg pulled your bum up off the floor, adding the blanket gives something for both sides of your bum to sit back down on so that you don't feel as though you've got a hanging side here. It gives it a connection point once again. Now, knees become a big factor in Gomukhasana. So if for you this is excruciating on your knees, it would be the bottom one that's going to be speaking to you the loudest. Your option would be to come into a half cow face, extending the bottom leg forward and still trying to pile this top knee up on the one beneath it. So that is a way of alleviating some of the stress that you might feel in the knees. And that might also be a point where you notice you want a blanket under your long leg side just to level off the hips, because when we don't have a blanket, you might feel yourself kind of shifting, falling over. I'm going to come back to the full expression of Gomukhasana. Wherever you are is fine. So adjusting the seat so that you don't feel as though you're shifting to one side, you can kind of just press back in, maybe add a blanket, perhaps a block. Now our blocks are fairly thick. There are also blocks that are a little bit thinner, maybe about 2/3 the width of this block. So you don't have to use a very large size block. It could be smaller. And if you're practicing at home right now and you have an old phone book that they still deliver phone books to my front doorstep, which I am always surprised by because I don't use phone books anymore. But so if you happen to have a phone book handy, that could be a width that's helpful for you. So a few options for deepening Gomukhasana if you want to feel more. So if you are the person that is feeling that this is good, but it's really just the beginning and you want to go further into Gomukhasana, you can hold the feet as if you're holding handlebars and begin to push forward as if you're bringing your chest down onto the thighs. So we don't want to hunch forward and roll over. We want to slowly begin to lean forward. And as you go forward, the top leg you're gonna see and feel so much more activity moving up through the back of the thigh, through the seat, and into the back of the hip on that top leg side. So this is a good way to turn up the volume of your Gomukhasana. And then we can come back up. We're gonna switch our legs, and this time we'll show what we can do with our arms in Gomukhasana. So same thing, we'll start by piling one leg to the bottom and then working around until we've got a knee pile. So here again, you might notice one leg doesn't go as far as the other one. So this is a tighter side for me. So my knees don't pile up quite so well as they did on the other side. And that's okay. We don't have to force the legs to match left side to right side. You don't have to push and squeeze and fight your way into this pose. This just might be where your Gomukhasana, your cow face pose is on this side. Maybe it will change over time. Maybe it won't. And that's all good because you're still getting the benefit. So even though this pose is not as big on the left as it was on the right, I'm still feeling a lot of stuff. How about you, lady?
I'm more comfortable on this side than the other side, though.
That's your good side?
Yep.
So this time we're going to demonstrate what cow face arms would look like. So my left leg is on top, Kaylee's left leg is on top. So we're both going to raise our left arms up and bring them down the back. And then we're going to take our right arms around and up the back. Now I'm going to turn around while we're here just so that we can see what might be happening. And I'm going to keep my head angled towards you so we can still hear. So my left arm is going up and coming down my back, and my right arm is going around and coming up my back. You might hold on to a strap or a towel if those hands are far from one another. You could just press one hand at the base of the skull, one hand into the back, or if you've got a lot of movement through your shoulders, you might be bringing hands to S-hook the fingers and create a little bit of traction in the shoulders. So I'm going to come back around to the front here. Readjust my seat. So what's happening in these cow face arms is on your front arm, you're going to feel from your elbow coming down the tricep and into the underside of your arm. That's all being stretched out while you're here. Now on the opposite arm that's coming up the other way, you're going to feel from your shoulder coming down through the bicep that is where most of the work is being done, that's the part that's feeling the stress. And then when we kind of press these in together, what we want to watch out for is we don't want to push the head forward. So if in the process of connecting the hands that caused your body to hunch over, we can separate the hands. We don't have to hold them so close to sit up tall. And if you're pushing your head out of the nest, again, separate the hands so that the head doesn't feel as though it's being pushed down into your chest space. So that is our cow face pose. Super hip opening practice, great for the shoulders too. Contraindications, things we would want to be mindful of is if you do have any rotator cuff concerns, if you do have any shoulder issues, shoulder sensitivities, maybe try it with a strap or a towel or leave the cow face arms out and know that cow face with just the legs is still a great place to be, but shoulders are going to be a big concern for cow face. And the same things like what we were hoping and focusing on with the hips, if you get into a place and feel that it causes you fear, anxiety, or if you want to stop breathing, that's a good way that your body's telling you this is not good for us right now and you want to stop. But if it's just kind of like a hesitancy or a tentative awareness, then that's a good indicator that proceed with caution. take some time and notice what happens, because it could still be a good pose for you. It might just take some time to get used to. All right, so we're gonna come on out of cow face. This time we're gonna extend our legs and shake them out and maybe swish them from side to side. And then our next pose is Agni Stambhasana, double pigeon pose. Again, huge hip opening pose. We'll go ahead and start working into it. For double pigeon, so if we were to start from Sukhasana, where our legs are slightly angled in but not piled one on top of the other, we're going to pull that bottom leg forward a little bit more so it's mirroring the top edge of your mat. And then we're going to try and top it off with your second leg. So in a double pigeon pose, we're going to flex the feet. That's going to just engage the muscles of your legs so it's protective. And we would like to perhaps line up an ankle on top of a knee and a knee somewhere on top of an ankle. I start with gap space, and that's just the way that my body gets ready for a double pigeon. You could also maybe have heard this pose called fire logs. I joke with folks that it's called fire logs because you're going to start feeling some heat generating in your legs, but also they look like logs stacked one on top of the other. Or you might have also heard it called square pose because this front edge looks like the front edge of a square. So if you are like me and you start with gap space, perhaps your option is to tuck a block in there. And what that does is it alleviates the pressure of holding tension in the hip flexor because now my leg is supported rather than sitting here and kind of buzzing, holding up that weight. If that was enough to make double pigeon feel good for you, perfect. If that still created some tension and some stress in double pigeon, your option might be to place the block just in front of your bottom knee. Instead of stacking your ankle on top of the bottom knee, stack your ankle on top of the block in front. And that's going to, one, take the weight off this bottom leg because we're no longer piling up on top of it. So that might give some freedom for your bottom leg, and it might also give some support for your top leg. So this is our double pigeon pose, and we're going to switch our legs out here. So your bottom goes to the top and your top goes to the bottom. And here you might once again notice that they don't start off the same. They don't do exactly the same. For this one, my gap space starts a little bit smaller, so I'm closer to a fuller expression of this pose. Now, if you are in a double pigeon and you do have gap space, but there's no pain, it's stiff and it's needing a little bit of assistance, a little bit of encouragement, you can bring an elbow down and kind of help to close that gap space. Maybe you bring an opposite elbow to the opposite foot, or rather, I guess, the same foot, and you can lean over and help pile the legs closer on top of one another. What you're going to feel is that this top leg, the rotation of your hip is now becoming greater, and so that's going to speak to you more. So we could do this. For folks that come into a double pigeon and feel like this is easy peasy, you could go further. You could bring hands to the mat and you could come down onto elbows, or you could maybe even go all the way down. I can't, she can. So play with them. One thing that we notice happens a lot in our yoga practices, for folks on the mat, especially if you're new to your yoga practice, is you might see a pose demoed and it does not look like a pose that your body is going to be receptive to. So a couple of things might happen. You might try less in that pose because you feel like it's unattainable for you anyways. or you might try too hard in that pose and you might push yourself past the point of productivity. You might push yourself into a place of pain. So what we always want to be aware of is my pigeon and your pigeon, they don't have to look the same. They could look wildly different. Your pigeon could be up here with your legs. You could have blocks under one or both of the legs. So know that this pigeon, although it's a little bit wonky looking, is still a good pigeon. So it doesn't have to be that pigeon all the time. It could be a very supported, very blocky, proppy looking pigeon, and that's still great. And even if you are using props to modify and support pigeon on one aspect, you still might be able to fold over and come into a fuller expression with the upper half of the body, because although your legs might need some support in half pigeon, the back line of the body, your back from your hips on up the spine, that might feel more than comfortable moving into a fuller expression. So feel free to play around with it. When you do come for yoga, no one is ever going to look at you and say, that's not the way I told you to do it. As a matter of fact, we're always going to say exactly the opposite. We're going to always encourage you to find your best variation of any pose that we come into, because that really is what yoga is all about. All right, so that was our double pigeon pose. We're going to move now into Baddha Konasana, which is again one of our more common ones. So Padmasana, Gomukhasana, Agni Stambhasana, those three poses that we just did, you might not see those very often, but Sukhasana, where we started, you'll probably see that often. And here, Baddha Konasana, you'll probably see this often. So Baddha Konasana translates to a bound angle pose. And so we bind by bringing the soles of the feet. Let me give you a little bit more room there. We bind by bringing the soles of the feet together and placing them down onto the floor. I'm going to show you a few different variations of Baddha Konasana, but before we start varying our Baddha Konasana, if you want to tuck that blanket under your sits bones. So again, just like in our Sukhasana and our Padmasana, that just created a little bit of a lift for her seat, a little bit of a forward spill for the pelvis, so that might have brought the bound angle pose from feeling tight and stiff to feeling a little bit more free and comfortable. If you are a person with hip flexors that are just not willing to relax and let the legs fall out, you might be tucking blocks or blankets underneath those. So although my legs don't roll all the way down for Baddha Konasana right here, it doesn't cause me any pain. I'm not feeling any tension, so I don't choose to prop for Baddha Konasana. Now, where to place your hands in your bound angle pose? You could reach forward and take hold of your toes if they're there for you. You could hold your ankle bones if those are more available, or you could just place your hands onto your knees, your shins, or wherever they go. Or you could place them on somebody else's knees. In bound angle pose, your back wants to feel lengthened and lifted, which is why the blanket could be a helper for that for you. I start off with a spacing where my feet and my body are fairly distant from one another, and I have kind of a diamond shape. You could move your Baddha Konasana so that your feet, if you were to bring your feet in a little bit closer in Baddha Konasana, what you might notice is that your legs fall out a little bit further, just because we've changed the angle at which your thigh bone sits in the hip joint. If you hold on to the toes and begin to lean forward, we're lengthening forward. One thing we want to be aware of is that we want to continue to draw up and engage abdominal muscles. So when you pull forward or lean forward, if you round all of your abdomen just became squishy and soft, and we want to try to keep some energy there. So lifting up, drawing the belly button towards the body so that there's engagement of the abdominal muscles. You're going to notice that that increases the amount of length that you're finding in the spine. And then just notice where your shoulders went. If they hunched up to your ears, maybe changing where you have your elbows, because if the elbows are forward, that might encourage your shoulders to move forward. If the elbows pull in towards the body, like you're pulling back on reins while you're riding a horse, that might encourage your shoulders to be more neutral, which again will enhance what you're feeling in your spine. And then final variation for Baddha Konasana would be to bring your feet out nice and wide so there's a generous space between your heels and your body, and maybe hands this time hold the ankles, or maybe they still reach forward. That's going to not create such a huge rotation, so my thigh bones are more neutral in the hip socket rather than being rotated out to the sides. They're more neutral, which could be a place that is more comfortable for some of you. So this might be your best variation of Baddha Konasana. And this time as you come forward, maybe as you're coming down, you're bringing your nose towards the feet. Not that they're ever going to touch, but that's the direction. Rather than feeling heart-led, you might feel as though you are bringing the gaze and the head forward a little bit. And this you'll feel is different on the sacrum. So the space where your right hip, left hip, and your tailbone kind of create that little triangle, that sacrum is going to feel like it's now being opened and there's new space across the sacrum because of the way we've adjusted our feet. So those are our three variations of Baddha Konasana bound angle pose. We've just got two final seated poses that we're going to go through very quickly because we don't see these very often at all. And one is hero pose and one is thunderbolt. They're going to look very similar to one another, but hero pose, we can start by bringing back one foot to the outside of the body and then the other foot to the outside of the body. And knees ideally would be rolled in towards one another. So for most folks, they might come out wide. We want to try to draw them in. And I will let you know, hero pose is a very intensive knee pose. So if your concerns lay in the joint of your knee, this is probably a pose that you are going to avoid during your practice. If the knees are telling you to proceed with caution and you still want to practice a hero, but you want to practice it on a smaller scale, you might do a half of a hero's pose, which will bring back just one leg rather than both. And if you've practiced yin with us, you might have heard this pose called a saddle pose. Now you still have the options if you're looking to support hero. Maybe there's a block underneath your seat, so I hope that that was visible to you. When I added the block, lifted up my seat, spilt the pelvis forward, allowed me to create more extension in my spine, but it also allowed my legs to roll towards one another in a much better way. And if I were to go back to my full hero pose, we can see here my knees are much more willing to roll in because I've lifted up the sacrum, which allows more space, which then allows my thigh bones to roll back to a neutral and slightly inward rotation in my hip joint. So that block relaxed a whole lot of everything, and I'll go back the opposite way for you. So if we were doing,
Is it like this or is it like this?
it's with the feet outside. You'll see in just a moment. No, they were on the outside. So if we were to go back the opposite way of how we came into it the first time, this would be our half hero. So my foot's outside of my bum. There's space right here. And I'm sitting on the block and I'm leaning a little bit. I don't want to be leaning, so we're going to come back up and straighten myself out. And then if I were to remove the block, coming back down to the floor, then that caused me to lean the opposite way, and it pulls my knees out and away from one another just a little bit. So ankles, you want to be mindful. Knees, you want to be mindful. This is not a huge hip opening pose. It definitely is more focused in what's happening with our ankles and our knee joints, and a lot of spine extension, spine lengthening. And then finally, if we were to go back into the full expression, my legs just don't stay as comfortably together when I'm on the floor as they did when I'm on the block. But so this would be our, okay. So if you are able to find yourself in a full hero pose where both legs are on the floor, or even if you are in a supported hero pose where you've got a block underneath your bottom, you can go into reclined hero. And I'm going to have you bring your arms across your belly. And you want to allow the arch of your back to occur naturally. This is not the time to tighten the abdominal muscles and press the low back muscles down onto the floor. You want to allow the low back muscles to tilt up, and you want to allow that natural arch to occur. Now, if going down onto your back in a flat reclined hero's pose does not make sense for you in your body, we've got the option of doing it with a block. And if you're using a block or a bolster, that's going to come to just about the lowest part of your ribs, and we can come on down here and find a supported reclined hero's pose with a blanket, a bolster, or a block. And when you're ready to come up, we're going to press into one elbow, bring the chin to the chest, and then press into the opposite hand and come on back up. And that is our hero's pose, which you won't see very often in most classes, just because there are a lot of contraindications. There are a lot of things to be mindful of. And then finally, we're going to do our thunderbolt pose, and we'll stay sideways for this one. So whereas hero pose kind of has W-shaped legs where they're coming out into the sides, our thunderbolt is going to have M-shaped legs where they come down and underneath the heels. So in a thunderbolt pose, rather than trying to get low into the floor, we're really focusing on space of the side body, length of the spine, and the ability to keep a toned tummy and a lifted heart. So one of the nice things is, as you're resting sits bones onto the heels of your feet, it creates just a little bit of space for your tailbone to drop down into nothingness. So that is where we can get a lot of lengthening of the spine while we're here. You can always add a block. You would just bring it between the feet, sit up a little bit taller, and then that's going to take some of the pressure off of the knees and ankles. Now, for the blanket, you would slide that between your thighs and calves and bring it down, and that could just provide a little bit of cushioning. Does that feel all right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. The other option would be, rather than bring the blanket underneath your thighs, between your thighs and calves, would be to bring it all the way underneath the shins. So for those of you that feel that this is stressful on the ankle bones or the shin side of your leg, it's going to offer a little bit of propping, a little bit of support there. And so again, we're firming the belly, lengthening the spine, holding the head up high. One thing I like to offer in our thunderbolt is reaching fingertips down towards the floor, pressing down into those fingertips, and if the floor feels far away, maybe pressing down into a block, but creating this line, and then slowly bring your chin forward towards your chest. Feel that that's a great long line of stretch and pull up the back side of the body, and a good long push down the arms, so it's releasing some of these trapezius muscles, our neck muscles. And then the final option that we could add to a thunderbolt is a toe stretch. So tucking your toes under And again, setting your heels back onto them. And so here, it starts off fairly mild. Sometimes you might have to stretch out to make sure that all 5 of the toes on each foot are actually rolling forward rather than just curling under. And then with the toe stretch, you're going to start to feel that it grows in intensity from your ankle, down your shin, and maybe even all the way through the leg, but still a good opportunity to tuck in the tummy, roll back the shoulders, maybe bring the chin forward to the chest. Feel the entire long line of the back side of the body. That's what we got here for. And so that's our thunderbolt. All right. So I want to thank you so much for taking time to watch this video. Throughout the month, when you come back for classes that we are live streaming, we will be incorporating, not all of them all the time, but we will be incorporating our different yoga seats into the classes that you're viewing. And please let me know if you have any questions. I'm happy to answer them, but I do hope that this brought a little bit of new idea or a new love for our seated yoga poses. And we'll see you next time.